Hey there, ready for a chilling story? Let's dive right in. The moment I stepped into the hotel, I knew something was wrong. It wasn't the way the old building groaned under its own weight, or the draft that seemed to seep through every crack in the ancient wood. Those were things I could understand, things that made sense in an old mansion turned into an Airbnb. No, it was the silence. A heavy, oppressive quiet that clung to the air, thick like dust. The lobby was grand but dimly lit, the kind of place that might have been beautiful decades ago, but now felt neglected, withered by time. The wallpaper was peeling in places, and the dark wood paneling along the walls was scuffed and worn. A single chandelier hung overhead, its bulbs flickering weakly, casting long, distorted shadows across the room. But it wasn't the decor that made me uneasy. It was the guests. There weren't many, 4 or 5 at most, scattered around the lobby in old armchairs or standing by the large bay windows that looked out onto the overgrown garden. But none of them seemed quite present. They sat in silence, their faces turned toward the windows or the fire, their expressions vacant, as if they were waiting for something or someone. I checked in with the manager, a stern-looking woman named Mrs. Avery. She barely glanced up from her desk as she handed me my key and a small pamphlet about the hotel's history. "Enjoy your stay," she said, her voice flat and emotionless. Her eyes flicked to the guests, then back to me, as if I were just another part of the furniture. I wanted to ask her about them, about why they seemed so strange, so detached, but something in her gaze stopped me. Instead, I took my key and headed upstairs to my room, the uneasy feeling growing with every step I took. The room was smaller than I'd expected, but clean. The bed was neatly made, with crisp white sheets and a heavy quilt folded at the foot. A small window looked out over the garden, but the view was obscured by thick, overgrown trees. The only other furniture was a dresser and an old wooden chair, placed awkwardly in the corner as if someone had just shoved it there to get it out of the way. I dropped my bag onto the bed and sat down, trying to shake the strange sense of foreboding that had settled over me since I'd arrived. It wasn't just the guests, though they were part of it. It was the whole place. The way the air seemed too still, too heavy. The way the floors creaked underfoot, even when no one was walking on them. I tried to distract myself, flipping through the pamphlet Mrs. Avery had given me. It was filled with the usual historical trivia, dates of construction, notable guests, stories about the mansion's former owners. But one passage stood out. Underscore legend has it that the mansion's original owner, a wealthy recluse named Henry Densmore, built the house as a retreat from the world. He filled it with strange artifacts from his travels, many of which remain in the hotel to this day. Densmore was known to be a collector of the unusual, and some say he dabbled in the occult. After his mysterious disappearance in 1927, the house was sold and eventually converted into a hotel underscore. I read the passage again, feeling a chill creep down my spine. The word disappearance seemed to linger in my mind, and I couldn't help but think of the guests downstairs, the way they sat so still, as if they were waiting for something to happen. I set the pamphlet aside and stood up, pacing the room. My footsteps seemed too loud in the silence. I tried the window, but it wouldn't open. The latch was rusted, and no amount of pulling or pushing would budge it. Frustrated, I gave up and sat back down on the bed, my thoughts racing. What was I doing here? Why had I thought this would be a good idea? The job had seemed perfect at first. A chance to get away from the city for a while, to clear my head and make some extra money. But now that I was here, everything about the hotel felt wrong, like I didn't belong, like none of us did. That night, the dream started. I was walking through the hotel's long, winding hallways, but they seemed different, stretched, warped, like I was in a funhouse mirror. The walls twisted around me, and the doors loomed tall and narrow, their brass handles gleaming in the dim light. I could hear voices, faint and distant, calling my name. but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't find where they were coming from. I turned a corner and found myself in front of one of the locked doors on the 3rd floor. It was different from the others, made of dark, polished wood with strange symbols carved into the surface. I reached out to touch it, but as soon as my fingers brushed the wood, the door swung open. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart racing. The next morning, the hotel seemed different. It was subtle, just little things I wouldn't have noticed if I hadn't been so on edge. The way the floorboards creaked under my feet, even when I was standing still. The way the air felt heavier, like there was something just beyond the edge of my perception, watching, waiting. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. But when I went downstairs for breakfast, the feeling only grew stronger. The guests were still there, sitting in the same chairs, staring out the windows. None of them spoke. None of them even moved. It was like they were frozen in place, trapped in some kind of limbo. Mrs. Avery was in the kitchen, preparing breakfast with mechanical precision. She didn't say a word as I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat down at one of the empty tables. I could feel her eyes on me though, watching me with the same cold detachment she'd shown when I checked in. I ate in silence, my mind racing. I needed to get out of here. Something was wrong with this place, something I couldn't explain. But every time I thought about leaving, that same heavy feeling settled over me, like the hotel itself was holding me here, refusing to let me go. After breakfast, I decided to explore. I didn't know what I was looking for. Exactly, maybe some kind of explanation, some clue as to what was happening. But as I wandered through the hotel's winding hallways, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The 3rd floor was empty, just like before. The locked doors stood silent and unmoving, their brass handles gleaming in the dim light. I walked past them slowly, my footsteps echoing in the quiet. One door in particular caught my attention, the same one from my dream. I stopped in front of it, my heart pounding in my chest. The symbols on the door were faint, almost invisible in the dim light, but they were their strange, intricate carvings that seemed to pulse under my gaze. I reached out, my hand trembling, and touched the handle. It was cold. Too cold. The door didn't open this time. It stayed firmly closed, but the feeling of something watching me grew stronger. I pulled my hand back, my skin tingling where I'd touched the handle. I turned to leave, but as I did, I heard the faint sound of whispering, coming from the other side of the door. That night, the dreams were worse. I was back in the hallway, standing in front of the locked door. This time, the whispers were louder, clearer, though I still couldn't make out the words. The door swung open slowly, and beyond it, I could see only darkness. But there was something there, something moving in the shadows. I stepped closer, my heart pounding in my chest, and as I did, a figure emerged from the darkness. It was tall, its limbs too long, its face obscured by shadows, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold and unblinking. "You shouldn't be here," it whispered, its voice echoing in the silence. I woke up gasping for air, my sheets damp with sweat. I didn't sleep after that. The hotel felt even more oppressive now, the walls closing in around me. I spent most of the day in my room, avoiding the guests, avoiding Mrs. Avery, avoiding the 3rd floor. But no matter where I went, I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched. That evening, as the sun set behind the trees, casting long shadows across the garden, I heard a knock at my door. My heart jumped into my throat. I hadn't spoken to anyone all day, hadn't even seen anyone since breakfast. Slowly, I walked to the door and opened it. It was Daniel. I hadn't noticed him before. He must have checked in that morning, but I couldn't remember seeing him in the lobby. He stood in the doorway, tall and thin, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes sunken and dark. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice low and urgent. I didn't want to let him in. Every instinct told me to close the door, to lock it, and never open it again. But something in his expression stopped me. He looked desperate. Reluctantly, I stepped aside and let him in. Daniel paced the room nervously, running a hand through his unkempt hair. "You feel it too, don't you?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. "The hotel. It's wrong." I didn't know what to say. Of course I felt it. I'd felt it since the moment I arrived. But hearing someone else acknowledge it made it all the more real. "They're watching us," Daniel continued, his eyes darting to the window, as if he expected to see someone standing outside. "The guests, Mrs. Avery, they're all part of it. They're not real." I frowned. "What do you mean, not real?" "They're trapped here," he said, his voice trembling. "Just like we are. This place, it doesn't let people leave. It keeps them. It's been doing it for years, maybe even centuries." My stomach turned. That's impossible. I can leave. I can leave anytime I want. Daniel shook his head. "You can try. But you won't get far. The hotel won't let you go. Once you're here, you're part of it." I stared at Daniel, trying to process what he was saying. It didn't make any sense. It couldn't make sense. This was just a job, a temporary escape from my life in the city. The idea that the hotel was trapping people that it somehow wouldn't let us leave was ridiculous. And yet, as I stood there, listening to the quiet creaks of the old building, the whisper of the wind against the windows, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was right. The hotel felt alive in a way that no building should. It was as if it had a presence, a consciousness, that was constantly watching us. "Have you tried leaving?" I asked, my voice sounding more uncertain than I intended. Daniel laughed, but there was no humor in it. I've tried. I've tried a dozen times. The first time, I packed my bags, walked right out the front door. I thought I was free." He paused, his face growing pale. "But no matter how far I walked, I ended up right back here. The road out there, the forest, it just loops back on itself. You think you're leaving, but you're not. You're just walking in circles." A cold shiver ran down my spine. "That can't be true," I muttered, more to myself than to him. "Try it," Daniel said quietly, his eyes dark and hollow. "See for yourself." I wanted to argue, to tell him he was being paranoid, but the truth was, I didn't know. I hadn't tried to leave since I got here. I hadn't even thought about it, really. The idea of walking out the front door, getting into my car, and driving away should have been simple. But now, the very thought of it filled me with a deep, inexplicable dread. I didn't want to leave. Or maybe I couldn't leave. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Daniel left my room after telling me to be careful, his warnings hanging heavy in the air. I tried to distract myself with television, flipping through the channels aimlessly, but the static-filled reception only made the quiet of the hotel more unsettling. By the time night fell, the unease had settled deep in my bones. I kept thinking about what Daniel had said, about the guests, about Mrs. Avery, about the hotel not letting us leave. None of it made any sense, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized that nothing about this place made sense. The guests who never seemed to leave the lobby, the locked doors on the third floor, the strange dreams that felt more real than they should. There was something wrong here, something deeply, disturbingly wrong. I decided to test Daniel's theory. I waited until the early hours of the morning, when the hotel was at its quietest. The lights in the lobby were dim, the chandelier casting faint shadows across the floor. The guests were gone, or at least I couldn't see them. The lobby was empty, save for Mrs. Avery, who sat at the front desk as always, her face expressionless as she leafed through some paperwork. I grabbed my coat and keys and headed toward the front doors, trying to ignore the knot of fear tightening in my stomach. As I reached the door, I glanced back at Mrs. Avery. Her eyes were on me, cold and unblinking, but she didn't say a word. I pushed open the heavy wooden doors and stepped outside. The air was cold and crisp, the night silent except for the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. I walked across the gravel driveway to my car, my footsteps crunching beneath me. Everything looked normal. The parking lot, the forest beyond it, the winding road that led back to town. I reached my car, unlocked the door, and slid into the driver's seat. For a moment, I just sat there, gripping the steering wheel, my heart pounding in my chest. It felt too easy, too normal, like nothing Daniel had said could possibly be true. With a deep breath, I started the engine and pulled out of the lot, turning onto the narrow road that led away from the hotel. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees that lined the road. I drove slowly, the uneasy feeling still gnawing at the back of my mind. But nothing happened. I passed the familiar landmarks, the old sign pointing toward town, the twisted oak tree that stood at the edge of the forest. Everything looked exactly as it should. I drove for about 10 minutes before I started to relax. Daniel had been wrong. He had to be. Maybe he'd just gotten lost in the woods, or maybe he hadn't tried hard enough. But I was leaving. I was. The road curved sharply, and as I rounded the bend, my heart dropped into my stomach. I was back at the hotel. The large, creaky mansion loomed ahead of me, its dark windows staring down at me like hollow eyes. I slammed on the brakes, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. This couldn't be happening. I hadn't turned around. I hadn't taken any wrong turns. But here I was, right back where I started. I stared at the hotel, my pulse pounding in my ears. The front doors were still open, just as I had left them. Mrs. Avery was still sitting at the desk, her eyes now fixed on me through the glass windows of the lobby. I couldn't breathe. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe I had made a mistake. Maybe I hadn't been paying attention. Maybe this was all just a horrible, elaborate trick. I threw the car into reverse and backed out of the driveway, my hands shaking. I drove back down the road, faster this time, my heart racing. The trees blurred past me, the road stretching out into the darkness. But as I rounded another bend, I saw the hotel again. It stood there, waiting for me, just as before. My chest tightened, panic rising in my throat. I drove faster, pushing the car to its limits, desperate to escape. But no matter how far I went, no matter how fast I drove, the hotel was always there, waiting for me at the end of the road. I slammed my hands against the steering wheel in frustration, my breath coming in ragged gasps. This wasn't possible. It couldn't be real. But no matter how many times I tried, I couldn't escape. The hotel had me in its grasp, and it wasn't letting go. By the time I stumbled back into the lobby, it was almost morning. My legs were shaky, my mind spinning with fear and confusion. Mrs. Avery was still sitting at the desk, her eyes following me as I crossed the room, but she said nothing. I made my way back to my room, collapsing onto the bed without even taking off my coat. I stared up at the ceiling, my thoughts racing. Daniel had been right. The hotel wouldn't let me leave. The next few days passed in a haze. I didn't bother trying to leave again. What was the point? The hotel had made it clear that I was trapped, just like everyone else. I avoided Mrs. Avery and the guests, keeping to my room as much as possible. But even there, I couldn't escape the feeling of being watched. The whispers grew louder, too. At first, they were faint, barely audible, but as the days passed, they became more insistent, more demanding. They seemed to come from the walls, from the floor, from the very air around me. And always, they called my name. At night, the dreams returned, more vivid than ever. I wandered through the endless hallways of the hotel, the walls twisting and warping around me. The doors loomed ahead, tall and dark, and I could hear the faint sound of whispering behind them. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't open them. And then, one night, I found myself standing in front of the door on the third floor, the one with the strange symbols carved into the wood. The same door from my dreams. This time, when I reached for the handle, it turned. I woke with a start, my heart pounding in my chest. The dream had felt so real, so vivid, that it took me a moment to realize I was still in my room. But the feeling of unease lingered, and as I sat up in bed, I heard the soft creak of a floorboard outside my door. I froze, straining to listen. The sound came again, closer this time. Someone was outside. I slipped out of bed, my bare feet silent against the cold floor. Slowly, I crept toward the door, my hand shaking as I reached for the handle. I hesitated for a moment, my heart racing, and then I pulled the door open. The hallway was empty. But as I stepped out into the corridor, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The door at the end of the hall, the door with the symbols, was open. I don't know what compelled me to move. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to turn around, to run back to my room and lock the door behind me. But I couldn't. I was drawn toward the open door, my feet moving on their own as I walked down the hallway. The door stood ajar, just enough for me to see the darkness beyond. As I reached it, I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest. I could feel something waiting for me on the other side, something that had been watching me since the moment I arrived. With trembling hands, I pushed the door open. The room beyond was small, barely big enough to fit a single bed and a dresser. The walls were bare, and the window was covered by heavy, dark curtains. But it wasn't the room that held my attention. It was the figure standing in the corner. It was tall, its limbs too long, its face obscured by shadows. But I could feel its eyes on me, cold and unblinking. "You shouldn't have come here," it whispered, its voice echoing in the silence. I stood frozen, staring at the figure in the corner. My breath hitched in my throat, and for a moment, I thought my legs would give out beneath me. It didn't move, but I could feel its presence bearing down on me, oppressive and cold. The shadows around it seemed to shift and pulse, almost like they were alive. The air in the room was thick, suffocating, and I struggled to breathe. My heart pounded in my chest as the figure took a slow step forward, its limbs moving in an unnatural, jerky motion. I wanted to run, to scream, but I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear. "You shouldn't have come here," the figure whispered again, its voice low and rasping, like wind through dead leaves. The sound sent a shiver down my spine, and I backed up instinctively, my hand brushing against the doorframe. What do you want?" I stammered, my voice barely more than a whisper. My mouth was dry, my thoughts racing as I tried to make sense of what was happening. The figure stopped, tilting its head slightly, as if considering my question. Its face was still obscured by shadows, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold and piercing. There was a long pause before it spoke again. "They all come here," it said softly, its voice now strangely calm. "They are drawn to this place, just like you were. They come seeking something they can't understand, something that waits for them in the dark." I swallowed hard, my mind spinning. What did it mean? Who was they? I thought of the guests in the lobby, their vacant stares, their empty eyes. I thought of Daniel, his desperate warnings about the hotel not letting anyone leave. "Are you?" One of them I asked, my voice shaking. "Are you a guest?" The figure didn't respond immediately. It stepped closer, the shadows clinging to it like a second skin. I could feel the temperature drop as it approached, the air growing colder, heavier. "No," it whispered, its voice barely audible. "I am something else." I took another step back, my hand gripping the doorframe tightly. My mind raced with possibilities: ghost, demon, some kind of twisted manifestation of the hotel itself. Whatever it was, it didn't belong in the world I knew. The figure moved again, gliding closer with unsettling grace. I could feel its breath now, cold against my skin, as it leaned in closer. "You're like them now," it said, its voice low and almost soothing. "You belong to this place. You've seen too much. There's no going back." "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "That's not true. I can leave. I'll leave." The figure let out a soft, almost pitying laugh. "There is no leaving. Not for you. Not for anyone." My chest tightened as the weight of its words settled over me. I wanted to scream, to cry, to deny everything it was saying. But deep down, I knew it was right. The hotel had trapped me. I could feel it in my bones and my very soul. I had become part of it, just like the others. Suddenly, the figure reached out, its long, skeletal fingers brushing against my arm. The touch was cold, so cold it burned, and I yanked my arm back with a gasp. My skin tingled where it had touched me, a dull ache spreading through my body. "You will stay," it whispered, its voice now more forceful, more commanding. "You will stay, and you will wait. Just like they do." The room seemed to tilt, the walls closing in around me. I stumbled back, my vision swimming as the shadows in the room seemed to grow, swallowing the light. I felt dizzy, disoriented, like the floor was shifting beneath my feet. I turned and bolted from the room, slamming the door shut behind me. My footsteps echoed down the hallway as I ran, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't stop until I was back in the safety of my own room, the door locked behind me. I collapsed onto the bed, my heart racing, my mind spinning. I had been right. There was something deeply, horribly wrong with this place. But what could I do? How could I escape something that wouldn't let me go? The next few days passed in a blur. I barely left my room, avoiding the guests, avoiding Mrs. Avery, avoiding the figure that haunted my dreams. I could feel the hotel tightening its grip on me, wrapping itself around me like a web. Every time I thought about leaving, the same fear washed over me, an invisible hand pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. They followed me everywhere now, a constant hum in the back of my mind, reminding me that I was trapped. I tried to ignore them, to block them out, but it was no use. They were always there, waiting. I kept seeing Daniel in the halls, too. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, like he hadn't slept in days. Every time I saw him, he gave me the same look and expression of quiet despair, as if he knew what was coming. As if he had already accepted it. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to try again. I had to leave. I packed my bag quickly, stuffing only the essentials inside. I didn't care about the job or the money or anything else. I just needed to get out of that place, to be free. I grabbed my car keys and made my way downstairs, my heart pounding in my chest. The lobby was empty when I got there. Mrs. Avery wasn't at the front desk. The guests were gone. For a moment, I thought maybe, just maybe, I had a chance. Maybe the hotel had let its guard down. Maybe I could slip away unnoticed. I pushed open the front doors and stepped outside, the cold night air hitting me like a slap in the face. I didn't waste any time. I ran to my car, fumbling with the keys as I unlocked the door and slid inside. The engine roared to life, and I pulled out of the driveway, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. The road stretched out before me, winding through the dark forest. I drove faster than I ever had, the trees blurring past me. But as I rounded the bend, I saw it. The hotel. I slammed on the brakes, my heart sinking in my chest. It was impossible. I had driven straight. I hadn't turned around. But there it was, the old mansion looming ahead of me, its dark windows staring down like hollow eyes. I tried again, and again. Each time I ended up right back where I started. No matter how fast I drove, no matter which direction I took, I always ended up at the hotel. It was hopeless. By the time I stumbled back into the lobby, The sun was beginning to rise. My legs were shaky, my mind numb. Mrs. Avery was back at the front desk, her eyes following me as I crossed the room, but she didn't say a word. I made my way to my room and collapsed onto the bed, the weight of everything finally crashing down on me. I was trapped. I would never leave. I belonged to the hotel now. The whispers in my mind seemed to grow louder, more insistent, and as I lay there staring up at the ceiling, I realized something. The hotel didn't just trap people physically, it trapped them mentally too. It made them part of it, until they were nothing more than empty shells, waiting for something that would never come. I closed my eyes, letting the darkness take me. Weeks passed, though I couldn't be sure how long. Time didn't seem to matter anymore. The days blurred together, each one the same as the last. The guests never changed, their vacant stares fixed on something I couldn't see. Mrs. Avery continued to sit at the front desk, her expression as cold and detached as ever. And I became just like them. I stopped trying to leave. I stopped caring. The whispers in my mind became comforting, a constant presence that reminded me of my place. I was part of the hotel now, just another lost soul, waiting for something I would never understand. One day, as I wandered the halls, I passed Daniel. He didn't look at me. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, but I didn't feel pity for him anymore. We were the same, after all. Trapped. Forgotten. I didn't fight it anymore. There was no point. I had become part of the waiting room. The Craigslist lifeguard job expanded version. I needed the money. That's the only reason I took the job. It was a hot, sticky afternoon in late July when I found the ad on Craigslist. I had been looking for work for weeks, scouring every job board I could find, but nothing seemed to stick. The bills were piling up, and my rent was overdue. I was desperate. When I saw the listing for a lifeguard position at a private pool, I jumped at the chance. The description was vague, just a few lines about a quiet residential property that needed someone for night shifts. It didn't pay much, but it was better than nothing. I sent an email with my resume, and less than an hour later, I got a response. _ can you start tonight? We'll pay extra for short notice _ It seemed too easy, but I wasn't in a position to be picky. I agreed and received an address shortly after. The house was in a wealthy part of town, far from the noise and chaos of the city. I thought it might be relaxing, peaceful even. A few hours by the pool, some extra cash in my pocket. How bad could it be? The house was massive. I arrived just before sunset, my beat-up car looking out of place in the driveway lined with sleek, expensive vehicles. The house itself was one of those sprawling, modern mansions, too much glass and sharp angles, all clean lines and minimalism. It felt cold, sterile, like something out of a magazine, rather than a place someone actually lived. The pool was tucked away in the back, surrounded by tall hedges that gave it a sense of seclusion. As I approached, I noticed how pristine everything looked. The water was perfectly still, reflecting the pale pink sky above. The deck chairs were arranged in neat rows, their cushions spotless and white. It was like no one had ever used it. I spotted a man standing near the edge of the pool, his back to me. He was tall, with graying hair and a crisp, white polo shirt. When he turned around, I realized he wasn't quite as old as I'd thought, maybe in his late 40s or early 50s. He had the kind of face that seemed ageless, like he'd been carefully maintaining his appearance for years. "You must be Thomas," he said, his voice smooth and pleasant. "I'm Mr. Gray. Thank you for coming on such short notice." I shook his hand, feeling a little out of place in my worn-out lifeguard t-shirt and shorts. "No problem. I'm happy to help." Mr. Gray smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "We don't get many visitors out here," he said, gesturing to the empty pool. "It's just me and my family. but we like to keep someone on hand for safety reasons. I nodded, not sure what to say. The whole situation felt a little strange, but I figured rich people had their quirks. Maybe they were just extra cautious. Your shift will be from 8 p.m. to 2 a.m., Mr. Gray continued, his tone becoming more businesslike. It's a quiet job. You'll have the pool to yourself most nights. Just make sure everything stays in order. Got it, I said. Anything else I should know? Mr. Gray hesitated for a moment, his expression unreadable. Just follow the rules, he said quietly. Before I could ask what he meant, he handed me a laminated sheet of paper. The rules were printed in bold letters at the top, followed by a short list. Rules. 1. Do not enter the pool. 2. Do not leave your post between 8 p.m. and 2 a.m. 3. If you hear splashing, remain seated and do not investigate. 4. If you see someone in the water, do not attempt to rescue them. 5. Do not answer the gate after 11 p.m. I stared at the list, trying to process what I was reading. Is this a joke? I asked, glancing up at Mr. Gray. What kind of lifeguard doesn't go into the pool? His smile returned, but there was something unsettling about it this time. Just follow the rules, Thomas. Everything will be fine. The first night. I settled into my chair at 8 p.m. Sharp, the laminated rules propped up on the table beside me. The pool was quiet, just like Mr. Gray had said. The water was still, the air warm and humid. Crickets chirped in the distance, and the soft glow of the pool lights bathed everything in an eerie, blue hue. For the first hour or so, I tried to relax. It wasn't like I had much to do. There were no swimmers, no kids running around, no noise at all. Just the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze and the soft hum of the pool's filtration system. But as the night wore on, the silence started to get to me. It was too quiet. Unnaturally quiet. At one point, I thought I heard a faint splash, like someone dipping their hand into the water. I sat up straighter, my heart racing, but when I looked around, the pool was empty. The water was perfectly still, just like before. I shook my head, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe a bird had flown too close, or a leaf had fallen in. But the longer I sat there, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The pool seemed darker now, the lights casting long shadows that danced across the water. I found myself glancing at the rules again, my eyes lingering on the third one. If you hear splashing, remain seated and do not investigate. I shifted in my chair, trying to ignore the growing knot of unease in my stomach. What was the point of having a lifeguard if I wasn't supposed to do anything? Another hour passed, and the unease only grew. I kept hearing splashes, small, almost imperceptible at first, but then louder, more insistent. It was like someone was swimming, their movements deliberate and slow, but every time I looked, the pool was empty. By midnight, the splashing had become constant. I gripped the edges of my chair, my pulse quickening. I couldn't just sit there and do nothing. It was my job to keep people safe. What if someone was in the water, drowning? Ignoring the rules, I stood up and walked to the edge of the pool. The water was dark, almost black under the faint glow of the lights. I stared down into the depths, my reflection wavering on the surface. For a moment, everything was still. And then I saw it. A figure. It was just a shadow at first, a shape moving beneath the water. But as it rose closer to the surface, I could make out more details: a pale face, long dark hair floating around it like seaweed. Its eyes were wide open, staring up at me. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure floated there for a moment, just beneath the surface, and then slowly it sank back into the depths, disappearing from view. I ran back to my chair, my hands shaking. I didn't know what I had just seen, but I knew one thing for certain: it wasn't human. the second night. The next day, I convinced myself it had been my imagination. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe the shadows had played tricks on me. I wasn't sure, but I needed the money. So, despite every instinct screaming at me not to, I went back. When I arrived, Mr. Gray was waiting for me by the pool. "You came back," he said, his tone neutral. But there was a hint of something in his eyes. Was it relief? Amusement? I couldn't tell. I shrugged, trying to act casual. "Yeah, it's just a job, right?" Mr. Gray didn't respond at first. He just looked at me, his expression unreadable, and then he nodded. "Just remember to follow the rules." That night, the splashing started earlier. It was soft at first, like the night before, but this time it didn't stop. The water rippled slightly in the darkness, and I felt the same growing sense of dread. I gripped the arms of my chair, my knuckles white, forcing myself to stay seated. "Do not investigate. The rules were clear, but it went against every instinct I had. I was a lifeguard. I was supposed to help people. But every time I looked at the pool, I saw nothing, just the dark, still water. By 11 p.m., the splashing had gotten louder, more urgent. It wasn't just ripples anymore. It was full-on thrashing, like someone was struggling in the water. My heart pounded in my chest, and I had to bite down on my lip to keep from jumping up. Every muscle in my body screamed at me to do something, but I stayed put. I wasn't going to break the rules again, not after what I had seen the night before. At exactly 11:15 p.m., the gate buzzer rang. I froze. "Do not answer the gate after 11 p.m. I glanced toward the gate, my mind racing. Who could be out there? Why would anyone be visiting this place so late at night? I hesitated, the sound of the buzzer filling the air again. But I stayed seated. The buzzer rang a third time, louder, more insistent, and I found myself gripping the arms of the chair even tighter. I could feel the tension building, the splashing in the pool growing more violent, as if whatever was in the water was reacting to the sound. And then, suddenly, everything went silent. The buzzer stopped. The splashing stopped. The air grew still, and for a moment, I thought maybe it was over. But when I looked back at the pool, I saw her. She was standing in the shallow end, her body half submerged in the water. Her long, dark hair clung to her pale skin, and her eyes, those wide, unblinking eyes, stared directly at me. Her lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear, and for a moment, I thought she was asking for help. I stood up, my body trembling. Every part of me wanted to run, but I couldn't. I was rooted to the spot, my eyes locked on hers. She reached out a hand, her fingers dripping with water, beckoning me toward her. I took a step forward. Then another. And then I heard it, a voice, faint and distant, but unmistakable. "Thomas." I whipped around, my heart pounding in my chest. Mr. Gray stood at the edge of the pool, his face calm, but his eyes cold. "Go home, Thomas," he said quietly. I looked back at the pool, but the woman was gone. The water was still again, dark and empty. I didn't go back after that. I didn't need to. The next morning, I received an envelope in the mail. Inside was a check for 3 times the amount I had expected to earn, along with a single note. _thank you for following the rules _. I never saw Mr. Gray again, and I never went near that pool. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the splashing. The Airbnb incident with Mara expanded continuation. I drove for hours, my mind racing with what had just happened. The quiet, lonely road that had seemed peaceful when I arrived now felt endless, like I was driving deeper into something I couldn't escape. Trees loomed tall on either side of the road, their dark branches intertwining overhead, creating a canopy that blocked out most of the sky. I couldn't shake the image of Mara standing in the living room, her eyes vacant, her movements slow and deliberate. It was as if she had appeared out of nowhere, like she had been waiting for me all along. But why hadn't she spoken? Why had she just disappeared into the shadows without a word? I kept replaying the scene in my head, trying to make sense of it. Mara was supposed to be my Airbnb host, someone friendly, someone trustworthy. She had glowing reviews online, people praising her hospitality. But the woman I saw in the cabin last night wasn't the Mara I had imagined. She was something else. After an hour of driving, I realized I hadn't passed a single car. The narrow road twisted and turned through the woods, the trees pressing in on either side, casting long, creeping shadows. My GPS kept recalculating, losing signal in the dense forest. I cursed under my breath, gripping the steering wheel tighter. All I wanted was to get out of those woods, away from the cabin, away from Mara. As I rounded another bend, my heart sank. Up ahead, nestled between the trees, was the cabin. I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding in my chest. How was this possible? I had driven in a straight line, followed the road out of the forest, but somehow I was right back where I started. The cabin stood silent and dark, exactly as I had left it. The front porch was empty, the windows dark and lifeless. It was as if the cabin had been waiting for me to return, like it knew I couldn't leave. I sat in my car for what felt like an eternity, my mind racing. I could turn around, drive back the way I came, try to escape again. But a part of me knew it wouldn't matter. No matter how far I drove, I would always end up back here, in front of this cabin, with its dark windows and silent porch. Reluctantly, I turned off the engine and stepped out of the car. My legs felt shaky, and my stomach churned with a mix of fear and frustration. I grabbed my phone, hoping to find some way to contact anyone who could help. But when I unlocked my phone, there was only one message on the screen. "You can't leave. It was from Mara. I stumbled back, dropping the phone. My hands shook as I picked it up again, staring at the message in disbelief. How could she know? Was she watching me? Was she somewhere nearby, hidden in the trees, waiting for me to return? I looked around, scanning the dense forest for any sign of movement. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, their branches creaking, but there was no sign of Mara, no sign of anyone, just the overwhelming silence of the woods. I felt a rising panic in my chest. I needed to get out of here. I couldn't stay in that cabin any longer. But where could I go? The road didn't lead anywhere, and my GPS was useless out here. It felt like the forest had swallowed me whole, trapping me in this nightmare. With no other options, I grabbed my bags from the car and headed back toward the cabin. I didn't want to go inside, but I had no choice. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the porch, and I knew that once night fell, the woods would be even more terrifying than they already were. The cabin door creaked as I pushed it open, the familiar smell of wood and smoke greeting me. I stepped inside, my heart racing, and locked the door behind me. The air inside felt thick, like the cabin itself was holding its breath. I dropped my bags by the door and made my way to the living room. The fire had long since burned out, leaving the room cold and dark. I grabbed some logs from the pile and started a new fire, hoping the warmth would calm my nerves. But even as the flames crackled and danced, casting flickering shadows on the walls, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I sat by the fire for hours, my eyes darting to every creak and rustle. The night pressed in around the cabin, the windows reflecting nothing but darkness. Every so often, I would hear a noise, a faint tap on the window, the creak of a floorboard, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. Around midnight, I heard it again. The footsteps on the porch. They were slow, deliberate, just like before. I could hear the wood creak under the weight of each step, growing closer and closer to the door. My heart raced as I grabbed the fire poker, holding it tightly in my hands, my knuckles white. The footsteps stopped right outside the door, and for a long moment, there was silence. Then, a knock. It was soft, barely audible, but it sent a chill down my spine. I stood frozen, my grip tightening on the fire poker. The knock came again, louder this time. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. And then from outside, I heard a voice. Faint, muffled by the door, but unmistakable. Let me in. It was Mara. For a moment, I stood there, too terrified to respond. My mind raced with questions. Why was she here? What did she want? Was she even real? Everything about this felt wrong, unnatural. Another knock, harder this time, more insistent. Let me in, Thomas Dot. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. My throat felt tight, my heart pounding in my ears. I stepped back from the door, my legs trembling. Mara, I finally managed to whisper, my voice shaking. What do you want? There was a long pause, and then her voice came again, softer this time, almost pleading. Let me in. I need to talk to you, Dot. I stared at the door, my mind racing. Something about her voice was off, too calm, too composed. It was like she wasn't asking. She was commanding. I glanced at the fire poker in my hands, wondering if I would need to use it. I couldn't let her in. I didn't know what she wanted, but every instinct in my body told me that opening that door would be a mistake. I'm not opening the door, I said, my voice firmer now. Just go away, Mara. Silence. For a moment, I thought maybe she had left. Maybe I had scared her off. But then, slowly the doorknob began to turn. I stumbled back, my heart racing. The door was locked, it had to be locked, but the knob kept turning, creaking as it twisted in her hand. And then, the door swung open. Mara stood in the doorway, her pale face illuminated by the flickering firelight. She didn't move, didn't say a word. She just stood there, staring at me with those empty, glassy eyes. My breath caught in my throat, and I raised the fire poker in front of me, gripping it tightly. Mara, please. Just go. She didn't respond. She stepped into the cabin, her movement slow, deliberate, like she was in no hurry. The door creaked as it swung shut behind her, the sound echoing through the cabin. I took a step back, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't know what to do. She was standing there, no expression on her face, just watching me. Mara, what do you want? For a long moment, she didn't answer. She just stood there, her eyes locked on mine, and then, finally, she spoke. You can't leave, Dot. Her voice was soft, barely more than a whisper, but the words hit me like a punch to the gut. I shook my head, backing away from her. I have to go, Mara. I have to get out of here. She tilted her head slightly, as if considering my words, and then she stepped closer. You can't leave, she repeated, her voice calm, steady. The air in the cabin grew colder, the shadows lengthening around us. I could feel the fire's warmth fading, replaced by a deep, bone-chilling cold that seemed to seep into my very soul. I backed up until I hit the wall, the fire poker trembling in my hands. Mara, please. She stepped closer, her eyes never leaving mine. I could feel her breath, cold against my skin, as she whispered again. You're already part of this place. You can't leave, Dot. Tears stung my eyes as I shook my head, refusing to believe her words. I wanted to run, to escape, but my body wouldn't move. I was frozen, trapped in the cabin, just like she said. And then, without another word, Mara turned and walked back toward the door. She opened it slowly, stepping out into the night. And just before the door closed behind her, she turned to look at me one last time. her lips curled into a faint smile. I never saw Mara again after that night. I don't know how long I stayed in that cabin, sitting by the fire, waiting for something to happen, waiting for the woods to swallow me whole, like they had swallowed Mara. When I finally found the strength to leave, the sun was rising, casting pale light over the dense trees. The road was empty, just like before, but this time I didn't get lost. I drove and I didn't stop until I was miles away from that cabin, from those woods. But even now, sometimes, late at night, I think I hear her voice. Soft, distant, calling my name from somewhere deep in the trees. The abandoned gas station shift. I had no other choice. My student loans were piling up, my rent was late, and I couldn't ask my parents for help again. That's how I ended up taking the night shift at a gas station in the middle of nowhere, on the outskirts of town, where no one sane ever goes after dark. The job paid terribly, but I didn't have many options. The ad had said minimal work required, which sounded perfect at first. But what the ad didn't mention was that the station was practically abandoned, miles away from any other sign of life, and that the night shift was eerily silent. I wasn't sure what was more unnerving, the isolation or the old, decaying gas station itself. The building had probably been there since the 60s. Faded neon lights buzzed weakly overhead, and the shelves were stocked with dusty, expired snacks. The smell of old fuel hung in the air, thick and stale. I couldn't help but feel like the place had been forgotten by time. Still, it was a job, and it was mine for the night. The first few hours passed uneventfully. I sat behind the counter, scrolling through my phone, sipping stale coffee, and glancing at the security monitors every now and then. Not that there was much to monitor. The gas station was surrounded by nothing but a stretch of empty highway and fields. Occasionally, I'd catch the flicker of headlights in the distance, but no one ever stopped. It was around midnight when things started to feel off. The lights above me flickered, just for a second, casting strange shadows across the grimy floor. I figured it was just a power issue. This place was old, after all. But then I heard it. A tapping. It was soft at first, barely audible over the hum of the neon sign outside. But as I sat there, it grew louder. Tap, 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 like someone drumming their fingers on the glass of the front window. I leaned over the counter, squinting through the dim light toward the glass doors. There was no one there. I waited, straining to hear if the sound would come again. But it stopped as suddenly as it had started. Shrugging it off, I went back to scrolling through my phone, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. But the silence felt heavier now, as if the station itself was holding its breath. At 1 a.m., the phone rang. It startled me so badly that I nearly knocked over my coffee. The landline behind the counter hadn't rung once all night, and I wasn't even sure if it worked. But there it was, the old rotary phone ringing, its sound tinny and shrill. I hesitated for a moment before picking it up. Hello. At first, there was nothing, just static on the other end. I frowned, pulling the receiver away from my ear slightly. Maybe it was a bad connection, or maybe the line was faulty. But then I heard it, breathing. Someone was on the other end of the line. The breathing was slow, heavy, like the caller was standing just inches from the phone, listening. My heart raced, and I felt a cold chill creep up my spine. I didn't know what to say, so I just stood there, frozen, listening to the eerie, rhythmic breathing. Then a voice. Soft, low, and almost amused. Don't leave your post. Click. The line went dead. I stood there for a moment, the receiver still pressed to my ear, the dial tone droning in the background. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it a prank? Some bored local messing with the new guy? But who would know I was here? I hung up the phone, my hands trembling slightly. The strange tapping sound returned, louder now. It was coming from the window again. I stepped out from behind the counter, my heart pounding in my chest, and approached the glass doors. The station was bathed in a dim, eerie glow from the old neon sign outside, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. As I got closer, the tapping stopped again. I stared through the glass, searching the parking lot for any sign of movement. The lights flickered above me, buzzing faintly, but there was nothing outside. Just the empty highway stretching out into the darkness. Maybe it was the wind, I told myself. Maybe something was caught in the breeze, brushing up against the window. But as I turned to head back to the counter, I saw it. A figure, standing at the far edge of the parking lot, just beyond the reach of the station's lights. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The figure was tall, unmoving, and I couldn't make out any details in the darkness. They stood perfectly still, facing the station, watching me. I blinked, trying to get a clearer look, but the shadows clung to them, obscuring their face, their clothes. Everything about them felt wrong, unnatural. My mind raced. Who would be out here at this hour? And why were they just standing there? I took a step back, my pulse quickening. As I did, the lights flickered again, and for a split second, the figure disappeared gone, as if they'd never been there at all. I spent the next hour pacing the small store, my nerves on edge. Every creak of the old building, every flicker of the lights set my heart racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. I kept glancing out the windows, half expecting to see the figure again, but the parking lot remained empty. By 2 a.m., I had almost convinced myself that I was just imagining things. Maybe the isolation was getting to me, making me paranoid. Maybe the figure had been a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the flickering neon. But then, the phone rang again. I jumped, the sound cutting through the silence like a knife. My hand shook as I reached for the receiver. Hello. Silence. Then, the breathing. It was slow, deliberate, just like before. My heart raced, and I felt my throat tighten with fear. I opened my mouth to speak, but before I could say anything, the voice came again. You saw me, didn't you? I froze, my blood running cold. Don't leave your post. Click. The line went dead. I slammed the phone down, my heart pounding in my chest. This wasn't a prank. This was real. Someone or something was out there, watching me. I ran to the window, pressing my face against the glass, searching the parking lot. Nothing. The figure was gone. But I knew they had been there. I had seen them. I paced behind the counter, my mind racing. What was I supposed to do? Call the police. But what would I tell them? That someone was standing in the parking lot. That I was getting strange phone calls from a voice that seemed to know everything I did. No, they wouldn't believe me. Another hour passed, and the silence felt suffocating. Every minute that ticked by felt like an eternity. I kept glancing at the phone, waiting for it to ring again, dreading the moment it would. And then at 3 a.m. it did. This time I hesitated before picking up the receiver. My hands were shaking, and a cold sweat had formed on my forehead. I didn't want to answer. I didn't want to hear that voice again. But I couldn't ignore it. I had to know. With a deep breath, I lifted the receiver to my ear. Hello. Hello. Silence. And then, the breathing. I gripped the phone tightly, my knuckles white. I wanted to hang up, to slam the receiver down and run. But something kept me there, frozen, waiting. Then, the voice came again, softer this time, almost a whisper. I'm coming inside. Click. My blood ran cold. I dropped the phone, my heart pounding in my chest. I backed away from the counter, my eyes darting to the front doors. They were still locked, the glass reflecting the dim glow of the neon lights outside. But I knew that whatever was out there was coming for me. I scrambled behind the counter, grabbing the only thing I could find for protection, a rusty metal pipe that had been tucked under the register. My hands trembled as I clutched it, my eyes fixed on the front doors. The station was silent, save for the faint hum of the lights above. But the air felt heavy, charged with the sense of impending dread. I stood there, waiting, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Then I heard it. The soft creak of the front door opening. I gripped the pipe tighter, my heart hammering in my chest. The door had been locked, I was sure of it, but now it stood open, just a crack. Cold air blew in from outside, sending a shiver down my spine. A shadow passed through the crack in the door, slipping inside the station. I backed up, my pulse racing. The figure stepped into the dim light of the station, their face still obscured by shadow. They moved slowly, deliberately, as if they had all the time in the world. My hands shook as I raised the pipe in front of me, my voice trembling. "Who are you? What do you want?" The figure didn't answer. They just kept walking toward me, their footsteps soft, almost silent. The lights flickered overhead, casting strange, distorted shadows across the floor. I backed up until I hit the wall, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure was only a few feet away now, their face still hidden in the shadows. And then, they stopped. For a moment, everything was still. The air was thick with tension, the silence deafening. Then, the figure leaned forward, their face finally coming into view. My breath caught in my throat. It was my own face staring back at me. I dropped the pipe, stumbling back in shock. The figure didn't move, didn't react. They just stood there, staring at me with my own eyes, wearing my own face. A twisted smile slowly spread across their lips. "Don't leave your post," they whispered, their voice cold and mocking. I turned and ran, my heart racing, my mind spinning. I didn't stop until I was outside, the cold night air stinging my skin. I jumped into my car, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. As I sped away from the station, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The figure stood in the doorway, watching me.